So first, what I'd like to do is introduce our panelists. Dr. Terry Anderson is president of Anderson Corporate and Executive Coaching, Incorporated, serving both the corporate and public sectors, mainly on the West Coast of the United States and Canada for more than 30 years. He's also the founder and past president and CEO of Consulting Resources Group International, a publishing and consulting firm. Terry is the co-author of Every Officer is a Leader, Coaching, Leadership, Learning, and Performance in Justice, Public Safety, and Security Organizations. He served as a professor to thousands of students who took his field of practice, leadership, interpersonal relationship, and problem-solving courses over the past 38 years. Nicole Jordan Mcbride is a lifelong Chicagoan and has spent the majority of her career as a community organizer in Chicago and other parts of Illinois, working in communities of color with residents from various backgrounds on issues that matter most to them. She is the former executive director of the United Congress of Community and Religious Organizations in Chicago, where she built relationships among communities of color to galvanize their voices to pursue racial equality. Nicole also led the Grassroots Alliance for Police Accountability, a coalition of community-based organizations in Chicago organized to develop a community oversight board for the Chicago Police Department and other public safety offices. She currently serves as the advocacy director for the New York University School of Law's policing project. Sheriff Leon Lott is a 43-year career law enforcement officer who has served for 24 years as sheriff of the Richland County Sheriff's Department in South Carolina, one of the largest sheriff's offices in the southeastern United States. Often referred to as America's law enforcement agency, Sheriff Lott's work has resulted in nearly 1,000 employees of the Richland County Sheriff's Department being recognized as one of the most creative, innovative, bridge-building law enforcement leaders in the nation. In so doing, Sheriff Lott has consistently enhanced the reputation of the Sheriff's Department locally, statewide, nationally, and internationally. In 2010, he traveled to Erbil, Iraq, at the invitation of the Iraqi government to help that war-torn country establish its first ever female police academy. Under Sheriff Lott's leadership, his department was the first law enforcement agency in the nation to establish a pre-PTSD conditioning program for deputies and other officers. This training is now mandatory for all of his department's deputies. He also serves as the commander of the South Carolina National Guard, holding the rank of Brigadier General. Commissioner Joanne Hardesty is a Portland, Oregon City Council Commissioner, having taken office on the Portland City Council in January of 2019. She previously served in the Oregon House of Representatives from 1995 until 2001. She's the first African-American woman to serve on Portland City Council. Born and raised in Baltimore, Maryland, she joined the Navy as soon as she graduated from high school. As one of the first women to serve on board Navy ships, she traveled throughout the Eastern Hemisphere. After her 6 years of service, she moved to the West Coast, settling in Portland, Oregon. She has presided over and served on executive boards of 14 local organizations, including 3 years as the president of Portland's NAACP. So as you can see, we have a very esteemed panel. There are lots of diverse experiences here and perspectives that we hope will help us flesh out this discussion. So we are going to talk about the intersection between policing and peace through the lens of the police use of deadly force. We hope to talk a bit about the challenges in creating solutions for what is really one of the most problematic social issues of our time, I think. My own background is that I've been in policing since 1978. Either at the local level, I spent 33 years as a local police officer in Southern California. The last 13, I was the police chief and the director of housing, recreation, and senior services. I then worked for the Department of Justice and then spent several years as the president of the National Police Foundation in Washington, D.C., which is the country's oldest nonpartisan, non-membership police research organization. It was founded in 1970 by the Ford Foundation as a way of advancing policing through innovation and science. And today I am now a consultant doing work for the Department of Justice and for cities and counties across the United States. There is probably no more incendiary policing issue today, I suspect, than the deadly use of force by the police. The policing in the United States is a very, very complicated topic. We're not going to answer all questions. We're not going to settle everything that there is, or even discuss even a fraction of the things that go into policing in the United States. There's more than 18,000 independent police agencies in the country. There really is not a national coherence about how policing should be done. So there are differences in this country on the East Coast, the West Coast, North, South, and the Midwest. There are differences in policing, whether you are in an urban center, in a suburban community, or a rural one. The challenge that we have, I think, in this country, when we look at policing and try to envision a better model or to operationalize a better model, is that because of the advent of the internet, social media, and literally everybody with smartphones, so that are video equipped, an incident that occurs on one side of the country that is tragically resulting in the death or injury of somebody by the police, that is filmed, becomes viral almost instantly, frequently before the organizational leader, the police chief or the sheriff, understands what happened, even knows about it. And community reaction to what they see transcends space and time in the sense that an incident that occurs in New York City literally results in protests in Los Angeles the next day, even though there appears to be no connection. But it's the way, I think, that we as Americans consume the services of policing. When we think about policing, unless you have a lot of involvement in policing in one form or another, I think it's easy for people to think that all policing is the same. The one bit of coherence, the national coherence around policing that does exist, is around use of force, in the sense that the US Supreme Court issued a landmark case many years ago that said that the standard by which the police use of force should be judged is one by which a reasonable person would see that. If they had the same training and experience as the police officers involved and knew what they knew, would their use of force be reasonable? And that may make legal sense. It certainly made sense to the Supreme Court when they settled that case. But that is a very problematic standard, I think, across the country for differing communities, for different states. And in fact, in my state, I'm living in California now, the state legislature has changed that standard, which they can do, to one of necessity, so that the police can only use that use of force if it is absolutely necessary. What has happened since then is now the police are trying to figure out what that means. How do they train to that? How do they change the culture? So we're going to now talk about that, and what does that look like in our various communities? What does it look like through the various lenses that each of us have and view this? So I'd first like to go to Commissioner Joanne Hardesty. Portland has been in the news almost, locally it's every night, right? But across the country, it was almost a nightly news experience. And protests have been going on probably longer there and more consistently than any other city in the United States, at least that I can think of. You see these issues both as an elected official and as a community organizer and a community member. So could you talk about how the community views use of force and what the challenges are for you as not only a community member, but now as an elected official who has legislative responsibility for this and leadership responsibility?
Yes, thank you so much, Jim. Thanks first for the invitation to be part of this esteemed council and committee, and also for the opportunity to talk about what's happening in policing in Portland. As I started thinking about responding to this question, Jim, I wanted to lay some context. I have been involved in police accountability work for well over 30 years in the city of Portland. I have worked under, I just counted, 7 police commissioners, 14 police chiefs, and I can tell you that the culture of Portland Police Bureau has not changed one iota in the 30 years that I've been working on police reform. There have been days that we've had excellent police commissioners or excellent police chiefs, but the culture itself consistently will revert back to status quo. Why is use of force so problematic? What we know as from a community perspective is that police can take someone's life, and when asked why, as long as the response is fear-based, I was in fear for my life or fear for someone else's life, no other questions are asked. And that has been the history of policing for the 30 plus years that I've been involved in police accountability work. We all see videos all across the country of egregious behavior at the hands of the police, but what we rarely see is police being prosecuted and held accountable for this egregious behavior. We cannot talk about police accountability without talking about qualified immunity, which is basically a get out of jail free card for law enforcement officers who brutalize and kill community members. As far as the community perspective, is there's just no justice in that because police are held to a different standard than you or I would be held to without a badge. The work that I've been involved in actually led to bringing the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division to Portland in December of 2012 to investigate the harm that was being done to Black and brown boys and men at the hands of police. The DOJ at that time chose to not address the issue, the racially specific issues, and instead elected to address how people who are suffering mental health issues were being impacted by policing. I will say we were disappointed as a community that they did not take a race head on, but that's for another convening to talk about why that would be. What the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division found was that police did use excessive force against people who had mental health issues or people who were perceived to have mental health issues. So that was in December of 2012. Here we are in December of 2020, and I can tell you today, after investing tens of millions of dollars over the last decade into Portland Police to correct the interactions with people with mental health issues, I can tell you today, we kill more people with mental health issues than we did prior to the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division coming to the city of Portland. I am now a Portland City Council member because I was angry. And I was angry because what I saw was over and over again, police union contracts that served police, but did not in fact serve the communities that the police are supposed to protect and serve. The last contract talks prior to me joining the city council were open and secret by a mayor who was leaving office in 2 months. It was renegotiated. Police got a significant pay raise and got all kind of incentives for encouraging their family and friends to become Portland police officers. There are a couple of other egregious things, but I don't have time to go into all the details. But that day, that was October of 2016, that was the day that I decided we can do better. We must do better. And that was the day that I decided that I would run for Portland City Council. And my time on Portland City Council, especially over this last summer, when the Black Lives Matter movement went global, the Black Lives Matters movement went global, the city of Portland since May 28th have had protesters on the street pretty much every single night. I think at the last count, we had 154 days straight of community members protesting, demanding more accountability from the police who are sworn to protect and serve us. I think there are many reasons why policing does not appear to be responsive to community needs and concerns. And I think primarily it is because mostly in this country, conversations about community safety have been led by police. Police are the ones that tell the community where crime is happening, who's committing crime, and how many resources they need to fight that crime as it is happening. It wasn't until this summer that I started seeing critical community conversations around the narrative that continues to be put forth by policing agencies, and seeing the community reject the premises that the police forces were putting forth. Because our community has experienced police brutality both by Portland police officers with excessive tear gas, excessive brutalization using their nightsticks. We've seen whole communities be tear gassed because a few people threw water bottles at police officers in full riot gear. I think we have to have a reckoning around how police show up when Black and brown people protest as compared to how they show up when white people protest. And a good contrast was the Women's March that happened a couple of years ago. Police came out and put on little pink hats and took pictures and posed. And as soon as you say that a Black Lives Matters protest will happen, police show up in full riot gear, ready to be aggressive and engaging with community members who are there actually asking for less police aggression and more community-related policing activities. I will end by saying that since I've been on the city council over the last 2 years, I have seen excellent actions by policing, and I have seen outrageous, horrific actions by police and our local police force. Everything depends on the leadership and the mindset of the leadership. What I know about policing is it is a military operation. And in military operations, as someone as former Navy, I can tell you is that the people at the top set the standard for how the people who are directly interacting with community members, how they will respond in those interactions. And again, because of my experience with policing over the last 30 plus years in Portland, I can tell you that we've had some police chiefs who are committed to transformation, and we've had some who are merely interested in articulating the words, but actually doing nothing different in between their agency. So I look forward to the conversation. I will stop there for the moment.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Lots going on there, and I only have like 300 questions for you now, basically. But we're going to move on to Nicole. You see policing really, I think, from having spoken with you several times, through multiple lenses, not only as a community organizer, but you've seen under the hood with your work about police accountability, the people you know in policing and the work you're doing with the policing project now at NYU. How do you see this issue of police use of force? What's the solution? How do police gain trust and credibility with the communities they're paid to protect?
First of all, thank you all so much for having me. I'm glad to be here and to be a part of this conversation with you all. I think, it's really hard to talk about what the future looks like without fully acknowledging the history. And whether you're talking about Chicago or major city USA, and probably even rural city USA, but specifically, we look at Chicago and Chicago's history, and being one of the probably harshest cities as it relates to racism and segregation, above the Mason-Dixon line, especially in Jim Crow era. And so, I think Commissioner hit on a lot of really, really important points as it relates to, the problems that we have with policing in the U.S. and in Chicago. It looks a lot like what's happening in Portland. And the reality is that police use of force and deadly force is not a new phenomenon, right? Like, this isn't brand new. This didn't just start happening, 10 years ago or what have you. Jim, you kind of set the platform for this earlier when you said that it was the advent of cameras, right? Everyone has a camera now. Everyone has, we have dashboard cameras, we have cell phone cameras, we have cameras everywhere, as well as we have social media, right? And so things happen and it shoots off at a speed that was probably inconceivable 15, 20 years ago. And I liken it is to the point now where you can no longer deny what African American community members have been saying, right? So it was easy to deny that people of color were being abused and deadly force was being used and so forth and so on because of two reasons. A, it wasn't in your face. And B, as the commissioner said, the narrative was being driven from one perspective as opposed to the community perspective. And that is now, and I liken it to even when, the civil rights era kicked off, because of television sets being in the home is when America could no longer deny that dogs were being released on peaceful protesters, that fire hydrants was being released on peaceful protesters. And so we have a long history of using extreme force, particularly against people of color. But it doesn't stop there, right? It's like we have this narrative that has happened that, again, is perpetuated that, well, there's more crime, so we need more police, or public safety is lacking, so we need more police. And I'm not here to ever bash any policing agency or anything like that. As you alluded to, Jim, I have people very close to me that are in the law enforcement community. But I can't deny that we have got to shift this conversation of public safety equals more police when we're not talking about what all encompasses public safety. And so we have to be able to have a real conversation about what public safety means, what it looks like, and allow that conversation to be driven from those who are most impacted by the lack of public safety. And so what we have seen also is that use of force has been codified in policing police policy. Pick your agency, and these policies are written and enforced, and SOPs are drafted right internally without any real community input, any community feedback, right? And so we see a lot of times unintended consequences, sometimes intended, but we see consequences that we could arguably have avoided had we allowed the community to be a real part of the process, to give a glimpse into blind spots that were in the development of these policies. And so what we see is that we have incidents that happen and we see officers being cleared because they were following policy that community members were not ever made aware of, were not a part of drafting. And I get it. I completely understand the argument that civilians or community members aren't police. They don't understand all the moving parts. I understand that, but that does not justify creating policies that will deeply impact someone's life, and they only find out about it when they are a victim of it. It's not fair, and it doesn't happen in any other way of life but policing. And so that is step one, right? We have got to start seeing community members as experts in their experiences. We have got to start seeing community members as experts and viable resources to help draft real policies that the police and the community can get behind. And then we actually can have co-production of what real public safety can look like in our communities. The last thing I'll say about this is that we also see this narrative of there's more violence, so we need more police, right? But we won't take a step back to see what that really means. And in Chicago, I'm sure everyone knows who's on this panel or that's watching this. We have a lot going on here in Chicago as it relates to violence. But I will also offer to you that violence is largely for two reasons, right? We see a lot of violence because of proximity, and we see violence because of necessity, right? And so when you put people in close proximity that have extreme necessity, and you also take away resources to help deal with the necessities that they have, and you put a concentrated group of people in this kind of scenario, what other outcome do we expect to have? We won't. We have taken away and we have drained communities of the resources that they need, on top of then putting more people of color and Black people in direct communication or in the direct line of sight of police officers. So you have youth who are having their very first encounter with an officer at 12, 13, 14 years old, drastically changing the trajectory of their life, oftentimes being funneled into a penal system, then refunneled back into the community, where you see a cycle of this kind of behavior and this kind of action that is all steeped in systemic racism. And then we blame the community for the situation that they find themselves in without addressing all these other factors. And so when we think about it from that perspective, we can't say that more police is the answer without saying we can't look at this in the vacuum. And then the last part I'll say about this is that it also creates this idea that Black men and Latino men are scary because this is what we see in the media. And so then we have to respond to them in a certain way, and we have to show up in a certain way because this is what this community is about. They're angry. Yes, people are angry because we have been drastically ignored and drastically underrepresented in those who have the ability to make the changes for our lives. And we have consistently been victim of this. And so I think in my last minute or so, how do we turn the corner of this is we have to have real conversations about this and not act like it's not a real part of the problem. And we cannot hide from it. We have to acknowledge it and then say, okay, how do we move forward from here? We don't get stuck there, but we don't continue to do the same thing and then expect different results. That's the definition of insanity. And that's kind of where we are as a country. And so in order to get to real peace, there has to be a reckoning, there has to be acknowledgement and a real conversation and a change of course, which means including those in the conversation who have been drastically left out.
Thank you, Nicole. I think you have in many ways very clearly outlined the need for community-led policing, right? The co-production of policing, the co-production of public safety between the community and police. Sheriff Lott, you have been both a police chief, you've been the sheriff a long time, you've been in policing a long time, you have seen a lot as a practitioner, and you've been a leader in policing the majority of your career. And you know the challenges of trying to affect changes in the organization to uphold the law, which is what the police are supposed to do on some level, and at the same time engage the community and fulfill that sacred commitment between your agency and the people that you're paid to protect. How do you see all of these things? How do you, as the sheriff, try to bind all this stuff together and create this outcome that we all seek in such a complicated way?
Say amen to everything that Ms. Mcbride had to say. I agree with her totally. We've been our worst enemy in law enforcement because we've operated in secrecy, and we shouldn't. There's absolutely no reason why we shouldn't have our citizens part of everything that we do. And some 24 years ago, that's what we started at Richland County, is that we have a Citizens Advisory Council. My best friend was the state director of the NAACP. We met each other on a ball field and became instant friends. And we decided when I was running for sheriff that if I got elected, the citizens need to have a voice in everything that we do. So we created a Citizens Advisory Council that we still have now. And it's just like she described. Why shouldn't citizens be part of our policies? Why shouldn't citizens see what we do, why we do it, how we do it, and be able to take that back to the communities that they represent? So we have some 27 people that represent all the different diversity that we have in Richland County, which includes Black Lives Matter. We developed a relationship when Black Lives Matter first started. Reached out to the person that represented South Carolina. We sat down and decided that, we have a lot in common and we can accomplish a lot more by working together than against each other. So we built a relationship and we've continued that relationship. And now as the new Black Lives Matter has developed in our area, we have them part of our Citizens Advisory Council. They have been for months now. We sit down, we talk, we decide what we can do. What do we agree all the time? No, we don't always agree, but we also agree that we're going to work for common goals, and that's goals is to make sure that everybody's treated equally and treated fairly. So I agree that citizens should be part of what we do, and that's what's made us successful in a lot of things that we do is because everything we do involves the citizens of Richland County. They have a voice. The Citizens Advisory Council is written in our policy and procedures. They have an open book on everything that we do. They see it. They have a voice. They're part of our hiring board. They have 2 votes on our hiring board of 7 people. They get to interview and have a voice in who becomes a deputy sheriff at Richland County. I think that's very important so they can see who represents us and represents them. So they have that strong voice. But we make them part of everything we do. And when you talk about critical incidents or police-involved shootings where we've made mistakes, and I say we, that's law enforcement in general, is we keep it secret. We don't want to discuss it. We hide behind this, well, it's under investigation, and so we can't talk about it. Well, when you do that, that just creates the opportunity for people to come up with rumors. They want answers. The citizens want answers. There's absolutely no law that says that you cannot get up as a chief or sheriff and say, this is what happened, this is why we did it, show the body cam, show the video. You can do all that at the very beginning. We have done that for 24 years. If we have a critical incident, I always respond to the scene within an hour or 2. I'm giving a brief to the media on what I notice happened so far. That lets the citizens know, okay, we've had a shooting. This is what we know at this point. Then by the next day, we're given a more in-depth press conference where we're identifying the officers. We're showing body cams. We're giving out what we can. That doesn't impact the investigation that's going on. That doesn't impact the prosecution that goes on. That's letting the community see what's going on. That's where we've had problems throughout the United States when there has been a critical incident and the police has just put up that shield and said, we can't talk about it. Well, the community is going to talk about it. And if they don't get answers and the truth from law enforcement in a quick manner, then they're going to create something. And that's when you have problems. And that's where you can prevent those problems by just being upfront and discussing it. And we've established a policy about doing that. But also we use the Citizens Advisory Council when we do have a critical incident. Before I have the press conference, I meet with them. They get to see everything, body cams, everything that we've got. They get to see it before I do a press conference. So they know what the truth is, and they can take that back to their communities and say, okay, this is what really happened. This is why they did it. That's accountability. That's transparency. We do have now modern technology. Everybody's a reporter. Everybody has a cell phone. So there's not anything you really can do anymore that's not recorded. That has been, to me, one of the best accountabilities that we can have in my profession is that we're recorded. And that camera can be your best friend or your worst enemy. It's your worst enemy if you're doing something wrong. It's your best friend if you're doing something right. So we rely a lot on that, and I shame on those agencies that don't release that information in a timely manner. Again, that's what creates the problems in the community. But the way that we built a foundation is reaching out to the different communities that we have and building a relationship. You don't build a relationship when a critical incident happens. You have to have the foundation a long time before that. So we make a concentrated effort to go out to the different communities that we have and build a relationship with them. That is on us. That's not on the community so much to come to us. It's on us to go to that community. And we do that. You have to have an agency that reflects the community they serve. You have to have diversities within your agency. You have to open your doors and your hearts out and give everybody that equal opportunity to come in and be hired and then be part of what we do. Diversity starts within. And then when we have diversity, that gives us a better force because then we can talk to each other and understand each other a lot better. and then that translates right into the community. So when someone in the community sees somebody who looks like them, then they're going to relate to them. That's going to help build that relationship. But it's all about building relationships. You know, we're called law enforcement. To me, that concept is that all you do is enforce the law. That is a very small percentage of what we actually do. And that's why we got involved in the Peace to Police, because I think peace officers accurately describe who we are. And it's not just words. It's got to be a culture. It's got to be a philosophy. It's got to be something that you live every single day. It's not just something on the back of a uniform or on the back of a patrol car. It is going to be who you are. And it starts at the top. I know the commissioner talked about some police chiefs that there, you know, it starts at the top. And if you don't have someone at the top who doesn't believe in working with the community and building relationships with the community, then you need to replace that person. As an elected official, I report every citizen that's in Richland County. As a police chief, I still reported to a city manager and a council, but I reported to the people also. And if the police chief or the sheriff's not doing the job that the people want, then that person needs to be replaced. That's the voice of the people, and the people's voice now is being heard, I think, more than ever before, which is a good thing. I don't see anything wrong with the challenges that we're facing. To me, that gives us opportunities. I think we have a lot of opportunities now to do so many good things, and I'm looking forward to embracing those, and I think we can do that when the community and their police force works together. I think that's where you're going to be successful.
So my guess is that just about everybody in the audience listening to you talk says this makes so much sense. It's so directly on point with how most people think police agencies ought to operate. Why doesn't everybody do that? So we're going to talk about that. But Terry, I'd like to ask you to kind of comment a little bit on what everybody has talked about here. Your area, you have lots of areas of expertise, but policing leadership and police culture change are key among those things. And so please address those things. But I hope that you'll help us try to understand when you hear the things that the commissioner and Nicole and the sheriff have just talked about, they just make so much sense. Why doesn't everybody do it?
Jim, thanks. And I really want to thank each of you for being the peacemakers that you are, and I join with you. It's my commitment from an early age that my mother taught me everybody's equal. Everybody deserves opportunity. Everybody deserves protection. And then I studied that for years and years, and I tried to find out why is it that some leaders get that and other ones don't. And in advising policing agencies about hiring practices, one of the things we discovered in an assessment center was if you ask the question, do you believe that all people have value? Some people just really hesitate on that question, and they don't really have an answer. Similarly, if you ask police chiefs when they're applying for a police job, do they understand organization development and community development? And do they have the skills to build a team that can make both of those things happen? Most of them it's not their fault. They don't understand because they have not learned how to do it. And I've found this so often, and it's part of the executive coaching I do with police chiefs, is to assist them to build a continuous improvement team. If they're willing and they do it, that team becomes the point of reference inside of the agency to solve internal problems. And it also becomes an opportunity for that continuous improvement team, which represents all different parts of the department, to invite different parts of the community into that team meeting, just like you're doing, Sheriff Lott, with your community advisory group. And I think it's just a wonderful open door opportunity. And different nations have been doing this. The UK's been doing this. They call it a collaboratory between the policing agency and the community other community agencies, but other community members as well. So the problem we face is one of educating leaders to be competent leaders, to be actually able to first understand how organizations and communities develop, and then secondly, to be able to learn how to implement it with a continuous improvement team. We all remember what happened to toys and watches and electronics and automobiles in the 50s, 60s, and 70s and 80s and 90s and right up to the present. Well, that's what has to happen to the agencies, that not just policing, but everybody needs to learn how to do continuous improvement. And it's not that difficult to set it up. It's not that difficult to run it if key leaders in each organization are trained and supported to make it happen. And I've done this in over 20 different agencies, and we've seen outcomes until a new chief is hired who doesn't have the competencies. And then that new chief oftentimes cancels the continuous improvement team because they don't want to be accountable to people in their agency, and nor do they want to be accountable to people in the community. And that shuts the whole thing down. Officers are demoralized because they got excited about this two-way communication that was going on between agencies and the community. And that just put a stop to the whole thing. And we have officers who are transferring to other agencies where there is a continuous improvement team because they got so demoralized when it stopped. So yes, leadership is so critically important, and we've developed a leadership development program, and it's now available through as a pilot through the Department of Justice. And it's called Every Officer is a Leader. There's a book available that you can access at commandcollege.org. But I just want to say that this is an opportunity for anybody to learn competent leadership and to implement it in their agency. The other thing that comes to my mind that is so critical is there's an opportunity, and it's happening actually, to build great neighborhoods, and how that reduces the need for lethal interventions. And the organization that's leading the way in the United States is called safegrowth.org. Safegrowth.org. That organization is actually working in a number of major communities, including Chicago, to essentially alter how they go about engaging the community so that the community has the capacity to be represented around that table in a policing agency. But they work from the grassroots up and then involve the police. It's kind of the opposite way that we would expect. Usually we expect the police leaders to do it, but this agency goes in and forms a neighborhood group who want to connect with the police, and they increase the two-way communication between policing agencies and the neighborhood groups. And that is also, they're having measurable positive outcomes, and I'm just really excited about their work. I think I could talk way too long, and I'm way too passionate, and that turns off some of the police leaders that I've worked with because it's so challenging, and yet it's really not rocket science. The leaders just need to learn how to do it. And we have to, I myself, in order to learn these skills, I had to go get training after I had a PhD in organization development. And I had to get certified as a strategic management specialist in order to learn how to do organization development that results in community engagement and development. So that's my best shot in a compressed time frame of 40 years of work. Thanks.
Thank you, Terry. I'll have some follow-up questions for you in just a couple of minutes, but I'd like to pose some questions to the panelists here for just a minute. Each of you has brought up many issues that are both, I think, national in scope and local to your own experience and your community's experience. But I'd like to ask Commissioner Hardesty a question. So you brought up a couple of issues that I think are really interesting. One has to do with the police reform measures that have been in place, some probably voluntarily employed by the Portland police and some involuntarily through the consent decree. So there has probably been some qualitative advances, I suspect, in the policing. And yet, in spite of those, the police are still using deadly force, if I understood you right, at about the same level as they were when all of that reform issue happened. So I guess I have one question for you, has to do with, so what's wrong? I mean, my own observations about many of the reform efforts we see in the United States are that they probably are good for the police. They increase the quality of policing, and the process is better and all that. But the thing that is just infuriating people, I mean, one of the many things, is when the police use force, especially deadly force, in a case that they perceive to be completely unjustified. And I think the sheriff was right on, spot on, when he talked about the need to quickly get information out, to be transparent and accountable. It's very clear that in a vacuum, people fill that vacuum with their own narrative based on their own experiences. So I really have kind of two questions for you. That's a long-winded way of my saying. So what's happening in Portland? Maybe I'll just take that one first, because I do also want to ask you about the impact of changing chiefs at the rate that you guys have done that. So the sheriff has been the one sheriff in his county for a long time, has been able to run, herd over those changes and see them from beginning to end. In that same period that he has been the sheriff in his county, you've had, sounded like a dozen police chiefs or something, and their tenure is not very long. So I guess I want to, maybe those are linked, but I'd like you just to talk for a minute about those two issues, because I think they have applicability in probably all of our conversations here.
I think that's true, but let me make one minor correction. We did not have a consent decree. We had a settlement agreement, right? So there's a difference between the two for folks. What I found fascinating when the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division came to town is they talked to any and everybody about what the problem was. They talked to community members, they talked to civil rights leaders, they talked to police officers, et cetera, et cetera. So they talked to a very broad segment of the community to determine what the problem was. When it was time to develop the solution to the problem, the DOJ went behind closed doors with the police and the mayor, who / also serves as the police commissioner, and came up with the settlement agreement, and then refused to change any word of the settlement agreement based on community input. And so there was a true disconnect between an acknowledgement of what the problem was and what the solution could have been. If I find that people are using excessive forces against a certain segment of the population, I personally would not then put them in charge of being first responders for that population. To me, that was just the stupidest thing imaginable. So what we did was develop a behavioral health unit within the Portland Police Bureau that supposedly had some training on how to engage people with mental health issues, but they're not on every shift. They're not available in every precinct. So some people are fortunate enough to get people with training and how you address people in mental health crisis. And some officers don't have the intensive training that other officers had. So let me just say, in my opinion, sending an armed person to engage with somebody suffering a mental health issue is the wrong solution to the problem from the beginning. That's why in Portland, we're developing a Portland Street Response that will respond to 911 calls, and we will have a qualified mental health professional, a EMT, and a peer supporter as a 3-person response team responding to calls that today go to the police. when we started developing this program, we went and talked to people who were houseless. We talked to people suffering mental health issues. We talked to business owners, etc., to build a program based on what the community said they wanted when somebody responded to a 911 call. I think the biggest challenge that we have in our communities is actually shrinking policing so that policing only solves crime. Police cannot solve our housing crisis. It can't solve the lack of mental health services that are available. Police have no input into alcohol and drug treatment programs, but we continue to, and with the police support, is to extend their reach into areas where they are not the best qualified to engage in those efforts. As far as police chiefs have a 2-year lifespan traditionally in the city of Portland because the buck stops with the police chief, right? So when something big happens, I loved hearing what Sheriff Lott said about said about how he responds when there's a critical incident that happens in the community. Because if all policing agencies responded the way he did, we would have less distrust of information we get out of police bureaus. Traditionally, and especially in Portland, what we're told is we can't say anything until the investigation has been completed. But while we're waiting for the investigation to be completed, the grand jury has cleared the officer. The officer is now back out on the street in uniform, patrolling the same communities, right? But meanwhile, the community is waiting, 6 months, 8 months for an investigation that we all know what the outcome will be, which is the officer did nothing wrong, and therefore there should be no discipline for that officer. We have a history here of just not sharing information, and I think if we had the kind of mindset that Chief Loft had, we would be able to build more community trust. We have a police force that only talks to people who agree with them, right? And you cannot make good decisions if you're only talking to people that agree with you. You get the best advice from people who disagree with you, so that you can actually incorporate whatever they're thinking in their mindset into whatever solution you come up with.
I think Nicole said this earlier, but what you just described is probably a very typical police response, right? There's a critical incident, the police shoot somebody, and they don't say anything, they can't say anything, whatever. And I personally don't know of any instance where that really works well anymore. It just doesn't work for anybody because people either don't understand it or they're not going to accept it. And as Nicole pointed out, that's as I think the quote originally was attributed to Einstein, saying that if you do the same thing over and over and expect different outcomes, that's crazy. And it doesn't seem to me to make any sense to do that. Sheriff, when you started doing that, did you have internal conflicts? Did you have pushback internally from the organization that said, well, this is nuts, we can't be telling people what happened, blah, blah, blah. How did you get over that piece? How did you get the organization out of this place that Joanne just described that has been there forever and that Nicole talked about earlier?
Well, if you don't believe in the philosophy you got, then you got to go work somewhere else. We give everybody the opportunity to get on our train. If they don't, then they're either going to get run over or left at the station. So, and basically that's what we did. We said, this is what I believe in. This is what we're going to do in our agency. And you're welcome to be part of it. If not, then you need to go work somewhere else. Very little resistance at the beginning, and those who did resist it are no longer here. Going back, stability has a lot to do with it. We've had I've been sheriff for 24 years. I think we've had 10 police chiefs in that time. That agency has issues because of not having that stability. The people elect me. The people basically tell me what they want their sheriff's department to do, and I listen to them. And you have to listen to them. And it does start with leadership. It's got to be in your heart, though. It's just not got to be something on a piece of paper. It's got to be something that you really believe in. And we have too many chiefs and too many sheriffs who sit their butts in an office and stay on a computer. You can't build a relationship with the community if you're not getting out with them. And you have to do that. When you do that, that sets a role model for your agency. So I think it's important as a leader that you have to do that, but you got to really believe it. Not just say you got to believe it and you got to live it. Our community embraced it. Before I got elected, the sheriff here was a racist, and he let everybody know that. So it made my job easy when I came in and defeated him, is that people were ready for a change. They were ready. So when I said, okay, this is what we're going to do, citizens are going to be part of it, people just really jumped on board and wanted to do that. And you can do that anywhere, but I will tell you that police chiefs, sheriffs, do this, that. You work for the people. You really work for the people. And if you're not doing your job, then the people need to get rid of you. And I get asked about term limits. I have term limits every 4 years. If I'm not doing my job, then I don't get elected. So I do term limits. The people are the ones who determine my term limits for you. But it's a belief that you have to have, and you got to reinforce it. Now, we've changed 24 years as sheriff. We're not doing the same thing that we did 20 years ago. We're growing. We're changing our training, and that goes back to police shootings. We never taught de-escalation before. Now that's something that we teach all the time, is de-escalation. That can prevent you from having to shoot someone, is how you just how the tone of your voice, your face expression, your stance, all of that goes into it. You can de-escalate the situation without having to take someone's life, but you have to train people to do that. They have to understand that it's okay to do that. That has to be part of your agency's belief. And you can do these things. I don't have a small agency. I have probably the largest agency in our state. And, so it can be done in a small agency that I did when I was a police chief with 7 people versus now what I've got, almost 1,000 people. You can do these things. You just have to have that, the desire to do it. One thing I want to touch on I think Terry talked about building relationships. We have what we call the CAT team, Community Action Team. Their main responsibility is develop neighborhood watches, community groups. They go into a community and help them get organized, and then that belongs to that community. We're there at all their meetings. We're there to give them information. We're there to listen to them. Somebody said earlier that law enforcement, we talk too much sometimes. We need to shut up and listen to our community and hear what they have to say, what their problems are, and then come up with solutions together. That's how you be proactive. That's what community policing is about. It's not being reactive. It's about being proactive.
Nicole, you commented a little bit about some of the things the sheriff was just talking about here, but I'd like you, if you wouldn't mind, especially with your work now with the policing project, your policing horizons have expanded probably quite a bit since, and they're broader than the work in Chicago, although my guess is your Chicago work has informed all of that. But a couple of things here that I think are important. You talked earlier about acknowledging the history of policing, which is, I think it's difficult for police leaders to understand why that's important, how to do it, and this idea that the thread we're pulling on right now about how quickly you get to the community to try to explain what happened, good or bad, right? So the sheriff, we haven't talked about this, but the sheriff and I talked the other day about some incidents where he and his staff uncovered bad behavior on the part of, for instance, one of his deputies. They took care of it. The person that was victimized by this deputy didn't report it. They found it. They took care of it, and then they went public with it. So they didn't have to, right? The victim didn't even report it. They found it. That seems to me to be speaking directly to some of the issues you were talking about transparency, accountability, trust and confidence in the agency to do the right thing, even when it's a bad thing, right? Talk a little more about why first of all, why that's so important, but also why is that so hard to do? And then Terry, I'm going to pitch this to you and say, so how do police leaders break through that? How do they make that stuff happen? So Nicole.
So I think that was like a couple of questions. Let me try to put it all together. First of all, it's hard to acknowledge because change is hard. Change is difficult, right? And if it was easy, we all would do it. And it's easier to believe a lie than to actually acknowledge the truth, right? And I mean, the reality is, sidebar, most of us will lose weight more, you know what I'm saying, if we was able to like actually face the truth about where we are, right? And it's the same thing. And it's like when we think about policing in any major city, we can't separate police without looking at their leadership. And I think this is what Sheriff was talking about in his leadership, and this idea of this is the way we're going, and whether you want to get on there or not, you have a decision to make. But I think that we don't have as many police leaders that are willing to take that level of stance, because policing is very politicized, especially in Chicago. It's very political, and it's difficult to make those kind of hard decisions in a very political atmosphere. I think also we also have to think about the training, right? And so how often do we go back and revisit training for new recruits? How often do we revisit how we're recruiting people and what the ground rules are for recruitment, right? And so we cannot honestly change a culture of people who have been reinforced in a certain behavior just off of one person coming in and saying, we're going to do things different. Because you have a whole group of other, particularly in Chicago, where, I mean, we have thousands of officers who some of them have been here for years. And if you've been doing things one way, even one leader to come in, and that's where it starts. But we have to acknowledge all of that. Like, we have to start taking more specific steps to look at how we're recruiting people, the caliber of person we're recruiting for this position. And then also, you cannot expect for trainees or recruits to come out of the academy having a community focus when 95% of their training was on paramilitary force, was on, it's very limited emphasis put on what community policing looks like, how we truly engage with community, the history of policing in particular cities. If we don't do that from the outset, we're saying from the jump that this is not something we care about. And so that's one. I don't know the other questions that you asked, but that's one of my answers to it.
I would love to follow up on that, because I think Nicole is right on the money when she talks about who we recruit, how we train them, and what do we tell them the expectations are when they show up in communities. I can tell you here in Oregon, we train law enforcement as if they're headed into a war zone. We treat it as if it's like, it looks like it did when I was going through Navy military recruitment. It looks very similar to that. We line them up, we march them. It's a very militarized approach to what we then call community policing. And the only time we bring community members into that environment is to share their tale of woe. This is what happened to me, right? I'm working with our governor at the state level to really reimagine how we do training from the beginning, who we recruit, who the trainers are. There should never be a training that doesn't have a community member as a co-facilitator, with the exceptions of tactical training and automobile training. Other than that, there should never be a police class that isn't co-facilitated by an officer and a community member. Because if we don't start doing that, it is unrealistic to expect 18 months later somebody's going to pop out as a community police officer. What we do is we train officers to incorporate an us versus them mentality. And so we the community, we're the enemy, and law enforcement are the good guys. And so if you train people that way, it is really unrealistic to expect them to then come into a community. And in our community, 90% of our police don't live within our city. They are suburban folks who don't engage with people of color in the communities they live in, but they come in and they police urban communities, and they police them as if they're going into a war zone or an enemy zone. And so that is a fundamental problem that we must fix if we're ever going to realize policing in a way that's different than what we see today.
Terry, you wrote an article that I read the other day, again, about changing the culture of policing and the challenges. All three of the other panelists have been talking about cultural change. That's really, that's what I'm hearing as we talk about this stuff. The way they've always done it, the reticence to change, the way they're being trained, the lens through which they're seeing these things and hearing the training instructions. The sheriff has come in and very strongly grabbed the tiller on his organization's boat, so to speak, and said, this is the new course we're charting, and you either stay on the boat or get off. Or I guess it was a train, so he's the engineer deciding where it's going, not the captain of the ship, whatever metaphor I'm trying to come up with here. Why is this so difficult? Why is it so hard when we can talk about this and we can identify these things and articulate? Why is it so hard to change the culture away from those things that Nicole and Joanne have been talking to and more toward the culture that the sheriff has created in his agency? Why is that so difficult?
Well, I guess the number one reason why it's difficult to achieve is that the way chiefs are hired does not include a competency assessment of their capacity to understand how to build an organization, how to build teams in the organization, and how the organization can actually build connections and interactions with the community. If they don't conceptually grasp it, and usually that requires a master's degree for them to have taken those courses in an OD program or a master's level justice and public safety program. But that, once again, I make the point, that doesn't mean they know how to do it. And so the successful ones call upon consultants who do know how to do it to help them first of all, do a community needs and problems assessment, set up a continuous improvement team that helps the community members with the internal agency employees on that team to build a strategic plan that addresses community problems and issues and desires. Then that team has to meet monthly or the whole thing crumbles. If that team is not meeting monthly to review its plans and objectives and progress and celebrating progress, the implementation of the strategic plan and the connections with the community dissolve. The root cause of the problem: chiefs aren't screened based upon an agreed upon necessary competence profile for chiefs. There's a lot of background stuff that goes on, but we did research that's based upon Kouzes and Posner's 5 practices of exemplary leadership. That research is the most solid in the entire world about what effective leadership and effective leaders do, their practices. Well, we did a study at San Diego Police and another one at Vancouver Police in Canada, an identical study, and we found out that officers say there are 40 tasks and responsibilities of effective leaders that they agree must be performed if they're going to be considering themselves as really effective officers, regardless of rank. And then we found out, how do we help them develop those 40 tasks and responsibilities so they can perform them? Well, they need 5 sets of skills. They need self-management, interpersonal communication, problem solving, team leadership, and organizational leadership, which includes community leadership. If they don't conceptually understand that, they can't do it, and it's not their fault. It isn't their fault. They don't know how to do it. And if the agencies that we've been in where we've shown them the opportunity to learn how to do it, they're hungry for it. They actually want to become effective and want to reduce the problems and want to reduce their stress and want to reduce community stress. We're not having a problem with people agreeing and engaging and locking onto this and embracing it. We're seeing just the opposite. We're seeing they really want it. But the universities are just now catching up to the innovations that have happened in the last 10 years. So they're starting now to begin to teach it. Our Every Officer is a Leader book has been used at a number of different universities, and with some really good reports from not only the professors, but the graduates who go out and lead communities.
Right.
So that's my really fast answer to a lot of research that's been done. But I would say unless we can find a way to equip people quickly, and we do have a 60-hour course that introduces them to all of these skills, and I'm not promoting it, I'm just saying it exists. And other agencies are producing programs that they're trying to accomplish similar objectives. So I would say the hiring issue is critical not only for chiefs, but for frontline officers. We ran an assessment center for 28 years. And we found out that certain people should definitely not be hired as cops. And we found out what dimensions those are that are going to cause problems and what questions they can be asked in an assessment center that are going to reveal that they're likely to cause the problems. So,
how many agencies, what's your experience with agencies that do what the sheriff's agency does, which at the hiring level, at the very front end of the assembly line, if you will, that brings civilians into the organization and turns them into cops? There are, Sheriff, correct me if I'm wrong, but you said you've got two community members that are part of that hiring committee. Did I get that right? Who have a vote as to whether or not this person is going to be a deputy in your agency, right? If I got that right, Terry, to what extent do you even see that? I mean, that if you think about how
Sheriff Lott, that's a brilliant innovation, and I think it's an extension of the trust that you're giving to the community, and that's why they're appreciating it and engaging in it. I don't see most sheriffs or chiefs actually going there because they're not confident they can feel comfortable in that situation like you are. They just don't know how to do it. They're afraid that there's too many political landmines they're going to step on and too much media is going to happen, and they just shrink. They just hide because they're legitimately afraid of the consequences.
I wonder if it has anything to do with the difference in the sheriff is he's elected by the people. Police chiefs are work at the will of the police commissioner, right? So there's some power when you know that you can make the case directly to the public for who you are and what you do, as compared to a police chief, right? Who, you know, if there's something bad happens, right, the scapegoat is the person at the top. And it's normally the police chief, because the police commissioner is not going anywhere unless they're voted out. So I think it's hard to compare where the sheriff has a direct relationship with voters. So he has to, right? He has to actually continue to build those community relations. Whereas a police chief, in my opinion, is actually responding to the loudest voices in the community. And normally it's the business voices that are demanding more police resources.
Sheriff, you were a police chief before you were the sheriff. And the agencies are hard to compare because there was a difference in size. But based on what Joanne just said, was that your experience, that when you were an at-will police chief, you can be let go really almost anytime? Now
Yeah, but
you have a 4-year contract with the voters, right?
But I had the Citizens Advisory Council when I was a police chief too. And what I've seen in our state now, our local police chief has it. I see a movement toward that. When I first started, I got criticized up until probably the last few years. Now what I've seen is that's a popular thing to do. We've had numerous sheriffs in our state now who are doing the same thing. We've had some that's resisted. One of the loudest one to resist it just got defeated after being in office for 32 years. He got beat. Because that's what he resisted, was the community having a voice in his sheriff's office. So, you know, you can do it. As a police chief, you can do it. I do want to follow up on something, though. I think the answer to a lot of our problems and issues was addressed years ago when President Obama had his 21st Century Policing Commission. They came out with a book that, if you read that publication, it gave you the answers to a lot of these issues that we're dealing with now. Problem was most people didn't do it. They took it, put it on the shelf, never read it, and never implemented the recommendations. The recommendations were, build relationships with the community, better hiring, better training. Things we're talking about now was addressed back then. It's just nobody forced them to do it. What we're seeing now is, though, agencies are being forced to do it, and they should be forced to do it. They should follow the recommendation. They should listen to what the people are requesting and want. It's going to be different in Portland versus South Carolina, but it all falls back to one thing, and that's building good relationships.
We have several questions that have been posed by the audience, and what I'd like to do in the remaining time we have is try to address some of these. This will be kind of the lightning round, so we don't have to dig real deep into these, or we won't get through them. But I think that these are important questions to ask as people ask this. So this one is more of a technical one, maybe for the sheriff. It says, I am an emergency physician in Northern California, and I wonder why police officers cannot be trained to shoot to incapacitate, such as shooting in the lower extremities. What say you, Sheriff?
If you're going to shoot your weapon, then that means that's deadly force. You're not going to pull your gun and just arrest somebody just to shoot them in the leg or the arm. And I hate to say it, our people aren't equipped for that. It's usually in a stressful situation that something's happened. And if you shoot somebody in the leg or arm, that doesn't mean that you're not going to take their life. So we don't train to shoot the wound. We don't train to do warning shots. If you pull your gun and you shoot it because that is someone's life's in danger, like we talked about before, either you or someone else. And you got to be articulate that. You just can't say that you're in fear of your life. It's got to be a lot more than that to explain what that fear of your life is. So, that sounds good. It looks good on TV, but as a cop for all these years and being in these situations, that is probably one of the most difficult things to do is to shoot somebody to wound them. And even if someone they have deadly weapon with them and you shoot them in the leg, you shoot them in the arm, that's not going to eliminate that threat. And so it sounds good, but in reality, that's very difficult to do.
Yeah, Jim, I have something I might add to that, and it's a new book that just came out by Charles Sid Heal. It's called Concepts of Non-Lethal Force. And he's talking about just how complex it is. And I think, Sheriff Lott, you just described the dilemma that officers find themselves in when they have to make that decision. And they're therefore trained to shoot for body mass in order to eliminate the risk of injury or death to other people, and including fellow officers that may be at the scene where this decision has to be made. So Sid Heal has explored all of the range of options of non-lethal force and the complex consequences that happen for each one of those options. It's a wonderful summary book. It's just Concepts of Non-Lethal Force is the name of the book. I was asked to review it by Sid, and I just was blown away by how instructive it was.
I think the commissioner, if I remember right, earlier in your comments, you talked about the problems that you saw with qualified immunity, the concept of qualified immunity for officers. So I think, a lot of community people would say there is no real consequence for some of these things. It may be, technically compliant with Graham versus Connor, which is the U.S. Supreme Court case. It may be consistent and compliant with our local state laws, but it's completely outrageous in terms of what happened. And because it's outrageous, we really can't hold the officers civilly accountable because of this concept. The city might be, but not the. Can you talk a little bit about how you guys view that in Portland and why that's problematic for you guys?
Absolutely. I can tell you that the last person who was killed by Portland police suffering a mental health issue, the police officer, within 9 seconds of arriving, pulled his rifle out and shot and killed him. This was an individual that they had encountered before, They knew this individual was suffering from mental health issues. The individual did not have a weapon. The individual, of course, in mental health distress was not following orders, but I don't know anyone in mental health distress that does what they're told to do. So from a community perspective, if this is an individual that you encountered earlier in the day, you knew due to your earlier assessment that they were suffering from a mental health issue, the community continues to ask, why is it that no one dies in mental health custody in our hospitals and our mental health facilities, yet a police officer within 9 seconds of arriving can make a decision to shoot and kill someone that they know is suffering from mental health issues? I don't think the difference is that different between what the mental health professional encounters with someone who is suffering from a mental health issue than what a police officer encounters. So why is it okay for the police officer to kill that person, but if the mental health worker killed that person, they would be suffering judicial action. They would be facing charges, they would be charged, they would be found guilty, and they would go to jail. So why are one profession who supposedly is trained to professionally intervene in these kind of situations, the other profession is also trained to intervene, but they don't have deadly weapons, so they use their voice, they use other mechanisms to control people in mental health distress. The community wants to know, why is it okay for a police officer to just show up, see that there's an issue, and shoot and kill somebody and have no accountability for it? And I don't accept the fact that if we shoot them in the leg, that somehow they're still dangerous. I just think the whole premise of the authority we give police officers to take life must be reevaluated, and we have to value all life, not just police officers' lives. Because the way the system works now is we're committed to the police officer going home, but I want to live in a community where we're committed to everybody going where they need to go.
Right. I think this is, I don't want to speak for the sheriff, but I heard him when he was talking earlier about deadly force, saying that you may be in compliant with the state law, but from his perspective as the sheriff, you better be compliant with my perspective, the department's perspective, policy about when you do that. And it seems to me that that message from a leadership position is critical to changing culture, to adhering all of that stuff. There's another question here I think that kind of fits into kind of what we're talking about. Nicole, I'd like you to kind of respond to this, if you would, just a little bit. If I can get it back. I lost it here for a second. So lots of police departments in this country. There's 50 states. Really, the state legislature has more to do with the regulations, the legislation around policing than the federal government does. We don't have a national model of policing. We have states have the ability to do that, and then you drill down to local communities. The state legislature might set the sidelines, but the local community, the sheriff, the police chief can decide something is different. So this question is, if the reality is that there's not one set of laws and regulations that prescribe the role of the police across the country, how much leeway do communities have in designing their own what kind of a police department do they want? A lot of the work you've been doing with the policing project is around those kinds of things, if I understand what the policing project's been doing recently. So Nicole, could you just for a second address how important it is for that voice, the community voice? You said this earlier, but the community voice to be rolled into what ultimately we see as a police or sheriff's department, that final product that's police service at the end. Can communities make it clear what they want, which may be different than what the state regulations say? You're on mute. You have to unmute. Can you? There we go. Try it again. Oh,
all right, there we go. It wasn't unmuting. Okay. I think, the fact that we don't have federal guidelines for policing is good and bad, right? because we have so many different police agencies across the U.S., there isn't a lot of coherency in what happens from one end of the country to the next. And the reality is that every community looks different. It has different needs and it's different, things that go into those communities. So I don't think we should have, I'm on the fence about federal regulations like that. And I think, the beauty of that is that, we talked about earlier how sheriffs are elected, right? And you have mayors you have police chiefs that serve at the will of the mayor. But the mayor is also elected, right? And so we have got to start making those connections to say, we're holding mayors accountable for the police chiefs that they're selecting to put in these positions. And that is a direct accountability line that we can have, and makes mayors be more accountable to their constituents about the law enforcement choices that they're making and that they're keeping in place. Because we also see where chiefs are not being fired when they need to be because they fail to lead in a way that they should lead for the people of the city. And I do think that there is place for organizing in this. I think that there's place for really getting communities, particularly communities of color, involved in this conversation. And I think that it also has to happen with this grassroots and grass tops. Like we have got to eliminate that. And actually there's a chasm that exists of information, and it leaves people, and I think Sheriff talked about this earlier, when we don't communicate, perception becomes reality, and then people become apathetic to that any change will ever happen. And so I think that there's a responsibility on city leadership to actually start invoking, community to be a part of these conversations. And there's a responsibility on us as community leaders, to also bring people into these conversations and show them why voting in your local elections matter, why voting for your alderman matters, why voting for your mayor matters, because these are things that impact your life even more so than a national election. And this is especially true in communities of color. In Chicago, we have we have 50 wards. And these aldermen directly impact what is happening on a very micro level as it relates to accountability. And I think that that's where we have to start seeing where we can actually shape what we want for police in our community and how we want our communities to be policed, and hold everyone accountable for co-production of public safety. And this is the things that we are working with, doing with police within the policing project, bringing everyone to the table and showing how this can actually be done.
Thank you. Terry, real quickly, what does a leader do in a state that has strong unions, and the unions are not helpful in terms of facilitating change? I have more than a couple of friends as police chiefs who have lost their jobs because they got sideways with the union, and the political leadership in that community decided that the union affection was more important to them than retaining the reform chief that they let go. A lot of reform chiefs have been fired in the last year or so. A lot of them.
My short answer to that is, if the chief assembles a continuous improvement team and has a union representative union president join the continuous improvement team and meet monthly, so that community issues and organizational issues are reviewed, and the president of the union can go back to the constituents and say, look, here's what's going on at the table. We're having to make a decision and make recommendations to the management and to city council and to the mayor. How might we best resolve this? So that two-way communication and dialogue is optimized, and it's encouraged, and it's expected. It becomes part of the norm. I haven't seen anything else work, quite honestly. I'm sorry.
One other question that I think that the audience has posed us that I think it's going to cause us to go over just a minute or two, but I think it's worthwhile. And this is what I'm about to ask you is a bit unfair. I want to be right up front with that, because this issue of police use of deadly force is so complicated that asking you for the one thing that can be done that can help reduce the number of people whose lives the police take. What is there a thing? And I want to acknowledge again that this issue is much more complicated than just one thing. If it was just one thing, we would have done it a long time ago. We wouldn't be having this conversation. But is there a thing that you wish we could do right now that would help that, or that we should stay focused on? We'll have a new administration shortly. If they were listening in on this, Commissioner Hardesty, what's the one thing you would ask them to focus on to help reduce the deadly use of police force?
I would say one thing that they could do immediately is to narrow the focus of police and make sure that we are only deploying police in order to solve crime. Again, as I said in my opening, we want police to do so many things that address social ills in our community. And we have to be able to say, no, it is inappropriate to call 911 because you're uncomfortable with what somebody looks like. No, sending a police officer out to wake up someone who's sleeping on a bench because they're houseless is not an appropriate use of our first responder resources. So we should be very clear that the role of police is to solve crime, period. And not let them expand into social service areas where they have no expertise. And my apologies, Jim, but I do have to go. City Council awaits me. Thank you very much.
City Council meeting. Thank you very much, Commissioner Hardesty.
You're very welcome. It's been my pleasure to be here. Have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.
Happy holidays to you. Sheriff, what's that one thing that you'd say to somebody in a power position that here's what we can do? Why don't we do this? What would that thing be if you have something?
The peace officer concept. Utilize the peace officer concept, not law enforcement, peace officer concept.
And I want to spend just a second talking about that. I'm remiss because I meant to ask you about this earlier. So your deputies' uniforms have a patch that says peace officer, and their cars have a decal that says peace officer. What does that mean? Why'd you do that?
Well, when we were approached about that some years ago, we went ahead and put peace officer on the back of our cars because that accurately describes us. Not a law enforcement officer, we're a peace officer. Our job is to keep the peace. So we started with our vehicles. The community embraced it. The community loved it. It was a philosophy that we believed in, and the deputies believed in it. And then we were approached about, let's put it on uniform. So on the back of our uniforms, we have a patch that says deputy sheriff, but it has peace officer on the bottom. Great example today, one of the deputies in Starbucks getting something to drink. The lady says, tell me about this peace officer concept. And he stood there for about 10 minutes and told her all about it. One of my daughters happened to be in there and watched and listened to it. And she said, Dad, you can't believe how long he stood there and just explained to this lady what it was all about, knew exactly what it was about. And they both left. The deputy left with a smile on his face, and the lady left with a smile on her face. It's a philosophy you have to believe in. So we believe it. So we demonstrate it with on our cars and our uniforms.
Thank you. And for those of you in the audience that want to know more about that, if you just Google police to peace, that's police and then the number 2 peace, police to peace. That'll take you to the Police to Peace organization that the sheriff was referring to, and you'll learn more about that. Kind of a interesting factoid in the state of California in the penal code, which is where police officer legal responsibilities and authorities are outlined. Nowhere in that book are they referred to as police officers or cops or law enforcement. They are referred to by statute as peace officers. So there's an opportunity for California policing, I think, to do what you've done and to rediscover their past. Nicole, what's the one thing that you wish you could pitch to somebody in a position of power to change the American policing? What would that thing be?
I think I have to echo the commissioners. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we lost you for a second. Go ahead.
I have to echo the commissioner, and because I don't think that we can fix where we are with looking at policing in a vacuum, particularly because of the politicization of policing and this concept of public safety. And it should not be on the shoulders, 100% on the shoulders of local policing agencies. We have got to invest and reinvest and super invest in social services and in allowing people to have a fair chance at a good life through the gate. And that is not something that should be afforded to only a few in our community, in our society, but it should be something that every child should be able to have access to. Because as I always say, if you talk to any 4, 5, 6-year-old, no matter what community they are from, they will always tell you, when I grew up, I want to be a doctor. I want to grow out. My daughter is on the Power Ranger kick right now, but she also wants to be a police officer, right? So what happens between 5 and 16 for a Black child and for a white child? And we have got to acknowledge that and acknowledge the lack of resources and opportunities that lead us down this path. And that is how we're going to change policing, because if we can get in right there, we won't need as many police on the back end.
Right. Thank you so much. Dr. Anderson, what's the one thing if you could do it?
Well, I spent 38 years training 8,000 students in the communication, self-management, problem-solving, team leadership, and organizational leadership skills, and I watched them go out into their careers, and they came back to me and told me what happened. So I would have to say every officer is a leader, equipping officers with a whole range of skills that they need to do de-escalation, to do, sometimes they are going to be doing community connections and community work and responding to mentally ill people before a mental health care worker shows up. They need those skills just like everybody needs those basic human relations and self-management and communication and team leadership skills and organizational leadership skills. Even if their organization is only their own family, the skills are the same. So I would say equip people with the knowledge and skills they need to be effective, decent human beings. And I know it's possible because I watched the consequences of those 8,000 people going out of my classrooms into the entire justice and public safety system, and they got promoted twice as often. They stayed longer. They had higher job satisfaction levels. The evidence is clear to me that I'm doing what I know is best by making sure this program reaches as many people as possible.
Thank you very much. I'll give you my 2 cents worth. This is just a very high-level pitch to, quite frankly, whoever the president is at any given moment. That just like John Kennedy declared that our next moonshot was going to be going to the moon, right? In the 60s, and people thought that was crazy. How could we possibly do that? And his response to that was, we decided to do this not because it's easy, but because it's hard. When this country says we have to give the police officers, sheriff's deputies, state troopers of this country the ability to do their job without taking life, we're going to continue to have these kinds of problems. Declaring it to be our next moonshot with a singular focus of ending that means there's going to be technological advances. I'm not even clear what those would be, but at some point they may replace what we call the firearm today. They may be programmatic, policy, training, all of the things all of you have talked about. But what I'm clear is we have to find what works, stay focused on the evidence, and not get diverted by other things that are important. But as we talked about earlier, lots of police reform initiatives have been put in place, and the police are still taking the same number of lives every year that they did back when we started recording that. So we've got to think differently about how we do that. I'd like to thank each of our panelists, Commissioner Joanne Hardesty, Sheriff Leon Lott, Nicole, Jordan Mcbride, and Dr. Terry Anderson. If we could applaud, we would applaud. So I'm going to applaud you. Thank you very much. And I would be remiss if I didn't also thank our sponsors for this, the Alliance for Peace Building, the U.S. Institute for Peace, New York University, Beta Gov, and of course, Police the Peace. Go Police the Peace. Thank you all for enriching my life through this process. Happy holidays to all of you. May peace, happiness, joy, and love be with each of you every day. Have a great day. Bye-bye.